Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another in the series from the Faculty of Humanities and Education, titled the Humanities in Action Virtual Seminar Series, Black Lives Matter, the Historical Quest to Respect Black Bodies and Lives. I am your moderator for this morning. I am Dr. Damion. I'm a lecturer in Gender and Development Studies at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies at the Regional Coordinating Office of the University of the West Indies. But in another life, in a previous life, I was a historian. I still am a historian. That's my training. And so it's really wonderful to be back with the humanities. And it's my treat and pleasure and honor to be moderating this session with two of my esteemed colleagues. I will be introducing Dr. Damion Blake and Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, and then we will have Dr. Blake start his presentation. So Dr. Blake is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Policy Studies at Elon University and serves as faculty fellow for race, ethnicity, and diversity education at Elon. Blake holds a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Science from the University of the West Indies Mona campus in Jamaica. He also has a PhD from Virginia Polytechnic and State University in Political Theory and Governance Studies. He's a Drugs Security and Democracy Research Fellow with the Social Science Research Council and the Open Society Foundation. He taught as an assistant lecturer in the Department of Government at UWI and in the Department of History and Political Science at Virginia Tech. Blake's research areas include organized crime and urban violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, race, democracy, and civic engagement in the United States, and Jamaica politics in general. Dr. Blake has several peer-reviewed publications on politics, gangs, and organized crime in Jamaica. This morning, he will be speaking on the topic, Is an Ethical Police Force Possible? After Dr. Blake presents, we will be hearing from Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, and she's a reader in political post-colonial literature at the School of Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett University. She teaches courses on African American, Caribbean, African, and Black British literature. Emily's research is informed by post-colonial theory and spans a broad range of concerns, including examinations of constructions of identity, in particular, hybrid and liminal identities, race, and politics. She's also an expert on the trickster figure in folklore, oral cultures, and literature of the African diaspora, and has published widely in these fields. Her books focus on the role of the trickster in Caribbean and African American cultures and include Anansi's Journey, a story of Jamaican cultural resistance, and American Trickster, Trauma, Tradition, and Bear Rabbit. Emily also develops her creative work alongside her academic writing, and I think we will be having a treat this morning where she'll actually be sharing some of her poetry with us. So we'll have Dr. Blake present first, and then we will have Dr. Marshall. And then after that, we will have about 20 minutes for question and answer. And we are so pleased to have an audience watching live on YouTube this morning. And we will be taking your questions from the chat. So we invite you to get engaged. This is an interactive session, and we will take your questions at the end of the session for both presenters. Dr. Blake, I ask you now to begin with, is an ethical police force possible?
Thank you very much. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay, all right. First, let me say thank you to Dr. Plummer and the organizers of the Humanities in Action virtual seminar series for hosting this hashtag Black Lives Matter discourse and dialogue. I'm particularly impressed, and I like the transnational and global content of the presentations. Hashtag Black Lives Matter began in cyberspace as a socio-political movement sparked by the July 2003 acquittal of neighborhood watchman George Zimmerman for the murder of Trayvon Martin. Certainly, hashtag Black Lives Matter joins in and draws inspiration from the 1960s civil rights and Black power movements, from the scholarship of critical race theory, from the Black feminist movement, from the anti-apartheid and pan-Africanist movements, from hip-hop and reggae music, and also from the LGBT movement. Across the reaches of the Atlantic world, the Americas, Europe, and the continent of Africa, the tentacles of white supremacy and anti-Black racism have led to racial disparities and oppression in education, housing, healthcare, judicial proceedings, sentencing, incarceration rates, and policing. Anti-Black racism is a unique strand of racial oppression and inequality. It targets and dehumanizes Black bodies. It restricts the movements of Blacks, denies them justice. And as we have seen in the last decade or so, within the context of the United States, the police's use of excessive and deadly force against Blacks, particularly, though not exclusively, towards unarmed Black men, is a result of what I am calling anti-Black racism. I didn't invent this term, it's in the scholarship, but I think it's quite appropriate for this discussion. And as I said, the anti-Black racism, while it targets Black bodies, and we see a lot in terms of police killings, that Black men are the victims, let us not forget that women also, Black women also have been the victims of police excessive use of force and deadly force. Let's not forget the Sandra Bland's and Breonna Taylor's, for example. So in responding to the question, is an ethical police force possible? We must recognize that a police organization and its mode of policing operates within a societal and political context. In the US, police units and policing first emerged as a measure of social control, and second, as a strategy for maintaining law and order. Race, and more specifically, the ideology of white supremacy and racism, has negatively influenced how police units carry out these functions. So in the context of calls for making Black Lives Matter, the societal biases that devalues Black bodies must be diminished and disavowed. Anti-racist narratives, ideologies, values, actions, and policies will have to be inculcated and institutionalized within police departments across the country. In other words, police reform and its ethical reconstruction will most likely happen when there is a broader societal push and legislative changes for social justice and racial equality. In colonial America, policing was an informal system built on a for-profit, privately funded model based on the English system. Towns relied on part-time night watchmen who mostly surveilled fellow colonists who engaged in prostitution and gambling. Economic elites used the police as a tool for protection of their shipping and mercantile interests. The first publicly funded organized police force, however, with officers on duty full-time, was created in Boston in 1838. In the South, however, the economic imperative that drove the creation of police forces was centered on the preservation of the institution of slavery. With abolition in 1865, police units in the South functioned in similar ways to pre-abolition slave patrols. From the mid-19th century into the 1960s, the police maintained the South's priority of enforcing Jim Crow segregation laws and the disenfranchisement of Blacks. The point I'm arguing here is that modern policing, which around about circa 1970s, in the United States, emerged as a response to the maintenance of social order, a socio-economic and political system that had embedded within it white supremacist ideologies and anti-Black racism. Michelle Alexander, in her work, argues that America's law enforcement and judicial system after the 1960s ushered in a new type of Jim Crow, that is, the mass incarceration of Black bodies. So, if we are to see ethical policing of Black and brown bodies and their communities, then a process of anti-racist socialization and training is necessary along with legislative and policy reform changes in police departments across the US. Black bodies, in particular Black men, are often viewed as symbolic assailants in the American body politic and public perception. They are commonly perceived in this way by the criminal justice system, especially among the police. Blacks are seen and presented as dangerous and threatening. Racism fuels the process of Black criminalization and produces racial stereotypical tropes such as the Black thug and the angry Black female. The US war on drugs, for example, criminalizes drug abusers and traffickers. However, Blacks are arrested and imprisoned at higher rates than whites and Hispanics for similar drug offenses. Such stereotypical perceptions expose Blacks to increased risks of having a negative outcome in their engagement and interactions with the police. George Floyd was criminalized by the arresting officers, and it resulted in his unfair treatment and death from the police's use of deadly force against him. And as we see on the slide, you look at marijuana use pretty much even between 2000 and 2010 based on FBI data. And in the same period, when you look at the incarceration rates between Black and whites, there is a huge gap, with Blacks being arrested at almost 5 times the rate as whites for the similar offense, in fact, the same offense. The US war on drugs, for example, we've said it already, okay. A 2018 Pew Research study notes that police killing of Black men between the ages of 15 to 34 are between 9 to 16 times more likely to be killed by police than other people. The US has a penal system that imprisons more people than in any other country around the globe. With 5% of the total world population, but 25% of the world's prisoners, the US is a mass incarceration state. When this data is further disaggregated, Blacks and Hispanics make up the larger shares of the prison population than they account for in the general US population. In 2017, according to a Pew Research Center study, Blacks accounted for 12% of all adults in the US population, but 33% of those in the prison population. Whites accounted for 64%, on the other hand, of the total adult population, but they had 30% of inmates. Hispanics represented 16% of the adult population, while they accounted for 23% of prisoners. It's difficult to have an ethical policing of Black bodies and communities when white supremacist ideologies and racial bias continues to infect police and policing in the US. I fully understand the racial realities of policing in America. I learned its values and operational structure since I arrived here in 2008 to pursue my doctoral studies. I've been stopped by the police 3 times, and on each occasion, I made sure that my wallet was on my dashboard and that my university ID card was atop my driver's license. And I tried my best to make no sudden movements. In the context of America's race-based democracy, an ethical police force is only possible when the men and women in uniform begin to see Blacks through non-racist and/or non-biased lens. This is where the process must begin, a kind of rehumanizing of Black bodies. So what are the prospects for an ethical policing? And I have about 5 points here. I'll delve into 2, and perhaps in the Q&A, we can talk some more about that. But let me start off with the one I think is most important: anti-racist training. The majority of law enforcement training emphasizes technical and tactical aspects of policing. there is an insufficient amount of training focused on anti-racism, implicit bias, mental illness, mediation, or cultural competency. So it is not surprising that many law enforcement officers perceive Black people as criminals and react to them based on that stereotype. Recently, the Department of Justice announced that it would start training of all its officers on implicit bias. As Ibram Kendi says in his work, to dismantle systemic racism in America, in all its manifestations, housing, education, healthcare, policing, anti-racist training and socialization is vital. The broken windows policy or policing. Eric Gardner was allegedly stopped for selling cigarettes. Alton Sterling was allegedly stopped for selling CDs. George Floyd for allegedly using a counterfeit check. The Department and Ferguson, that the Ferguson Police Department overwhelmingly fined and arrested people, particularly Black people, multiple times for minor municipal code violations. These practices stem from the broken windows theory, which asserts that addressing low-level disorder issues, such as broken windows, is necessary to prevent more serious crimes. However, many criminal justice experts, such as Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson, have concluded that the broken windows theory is actually a measure of informal social control. In New York City, for example, data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, BJS, showed 81% of people stopped and frisked were innocent, and 84% of all people stopped were Black or Latinx. In Chicago, Black people are 32% of the population, but 72% of all stops. These policies and practices are not exclusive to New York City and Chicago, as we have seen. It is widespread across the United States. So in closing, I want to reiterate that an ethical police force in the US is possible, but only after a process of decolonization and unlearning of the white supremacist and anti-Black racist values, perceptions, and ideologies that dehumanize Blacks. And this can happen along with policy and legislative reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Damion, for that thought-provoking discussion, PowerPoint, some of those images, so riveting. And I have quite a few questions already, but I will save them for after Emily's presentation, and then we'll get that sort of...
What was good on time?
Very good. Very good. Very good. Thank you so much. So yes, we are moving across the pond, as they say, to Dr. Emily Zobel Marshall, who will be presenting on Black Lives Matter protests, stately homes, and statuses in the United Kingdom. Over to you, Emily.
Hello, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And thank you so much to my good friends Nicole and Dahlia for inviting me to take part in this excellent Humanities in Action seminar series. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK. I'm also going to touch on the way we remember. So looking at how statues and cities and stately homes, which have been shaped by colonialism, need to be, how their narratives need to be rewritten and reshaped. So my presentation is in three parts. I'm going to start by outlining the Black Lives Matter protests in the UK. Then we're going to move on to how we remember stately homes in the UK, and then looking at statues, memorials, and ending by telling you a little bit about David Olawale, who's a Nigerian migrant who was killed by the hands of racist police officers in Leeds, my hometown. So first of all, a little bit of background, although Damion Blake has already provided some. In the US, in July 2013, the Black Lives Matter movements begin with the use of the hashtag Black Lives Matter on social media after the shooting of African-American teen Trayvon Martin. George Floyd dies in Minneapolis on the 25th of May, 2020, after Derek Chauvin kneels on his neck. He says several times, "I can't breathe." However, as the academics Salisbury, Connolly, and Wangari Jones state in the article, "The UK is not innocent, Black Lives Matter, Policing and Abolition in the UK," positioning Floyd's death as exceptional, the actions of one unusually bad police officer obscures the everydayness of deaths following police contact. There were only 27 days in the whole of 2019 where police did not kill someone in the US, with black people making up 3 times as many of the victims than white people in that year. Now, as you may well know, Black Lives Matter movement is very much a decentralized organization. Unlike the US civil rights movement, and there's some very interesting comparisons to be made there, the US civil rights movement focused very much on great male leaders, whereas the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by women with a strong feminist agenda. It embraces women, transgender and non-binary identities and other marginalized people. So there's a focus on a feminist agenda and a focus on women. The authors of Black Lives Matter, Past, Present and Futures argue that Black Lives Matter importantly challenges popular and dominant narratives of civil rights that typically depend upon masculine, African-American, charismatic ideals. Inspired in many ways by Dr. King's popular legacy, these ideals posit male orators as history's heroic agents and self-sacrificing women as unselfish martyrs, heroic in their voluntary suffering. So the Black Lives Matter movement, shakes up the basis of that type of protesting, which is focused around the great male leader. Now let's move on to looking at Black Lives Matter and the situation in the UK. Now, thousands of protesters marched in solidarity with the US protesters over the summer of 2020. But it was not just in solidarity, it was also to highlight and fight against institutional racism here in the UK. As Dr. Joseph Salisbury says, the British academic in sociology, he said people are starting to connect the dots with what's going on in the UK. So it was not just solidarity, but it's also to highlight institutionalized racism in the UK. And what was very, new about these Black Lives Matter movements in the UK is that it wasn't just, it was a vast number of allies, of white allies, of people from all different ethnicities who joined the protesters. And we've actually seen that across the globe this summer, which gave the movement such momentum. Now, official figures show that police in England and Wales are 3 times more likely to arrest a black person than a white person, and 5 times more likely to use force. Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched in the UK. So often racist policing is seen by people in the UK as a problem not over here, but over there in the US. But it's very much over here too. In the UK, what we tend to see often is a more covert than overt form of racism. And this has always been the case. I think this is wonderfully captured in the famous novel by Sam Selvon, Lonely Londoners. So Moses is a migrant from Trinidad, and he advises a fellow migrant, Galahad, who's trying to find work. He says, they don't tell you outright that they don't want coloured fellas. They just say, sorry, the vacancy get filled. And then Galahad asks Moses, the character Moses, is racism in the UK worse than in America? And Moses replies, the thing is, in America, they don't like you and they tell you straight, so you know where you stand. Over here is the old English diplomacy. And I love the way he says that, the old English diplomacy. Thank you, sir. How do you do? And that sort of thing. So the old English diplomacy is often a much more covert form of racism where prejudices exist, but they often are are hidden away. People don't tell it to you straight. Certain big political events in the UK that have really fanned the flames of these protests. One of them has been the Brexit vote, and the Brexit vote in many ways gave permission to voice their prejudices. My mother, my late mother, who's a black woman living in the UK, felt that after the Brexit vote, people were much more likely to say things directly to her, so become more overt in their racist feelings. So, for example, when she was in the swimming pool after the Brexit vote, someone said to her, "We don't want people like you over here." So she came here in the 60s, and she said never in all her life in the UK had she felt such a sense of not belonging and not being wanted than after Brexit. The Grenfell tragedy also, which led to the deaths of 72 people, many of them Black and Asian, has also given people much more reason to protest, as has the Windrush scandal in 2018, where thousands of people from Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean and Africa were wrongly told that they were in Britain illegally. So the Black Lives Matter protests this summer include Hyde Park in London, Manchester, Bristol, Cardiff. There were thousands of protesters, and they carried placards about the deaths of Black people killed in the UK. Sarah Reid, Sean Rigg, Leon Patterson, just to name a few. Leeds, so here you see the Black Lives Matter protests in London in June. And the placards say their names, the list of Black people killed, many of them by the hands of police. We see protesters stopping to sit in the road. And this is a more recent protest. You see that the momentum of the protest hasn't been lost. That's on August the 30th. And Leeds, my hometown, also had a big Black Lives Matter protest in Millennium Square. And very much like the US Black Lives Matter movement, there are several different groups operating within the UK. There's Black Voices Matter, Black Lives Matter UK, and so on. And over the summer, as a personal experience, a lot of media channels are reaching out to me to ask for, to comment on the protests and to comment on the momentum of the movement. So there's a lot of interest in the media. I think there is a danger now that some of that momentum is lost while the media does not focus as much on the movement. So let's just hope that some of those conversations that have started may continue. And this is the demands of the All Black Lives UK movement. So you can see there their demands: commit to ending racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, reform the education system, commit to ending racial health disparities, and implement the recommendations of all the reviews already undertaken by the government. Because this is one of the issues that we face in the UK, is that reviews have been taken, but the actual recommendations have not been absorbed into government policy. So they list the reviews there, the Windrush lessons, for example. Now, I want to move on to talking about stately homes in the UK, because this is another issue that's opened up over the summer. We've long known that much of the wealth of stately homes in the UK come from slavery. But this was highlighted in several news reports in the summer. And I also worked with a stately home called Harwood House quite closely to start a dialogue about how they could better address the history of enslavement in their exhibition to the public. So, for example, there's the article here: up to a third of National Trust historic homes have slave trade links. And for those of you that have perhaps not visited the UK, the stately home is very much a kind of nostalgic colonial throwback. People love to go to the stately homes and have a cream tea on the lawn, enjoy the splendour of the garden. It kind of harks back to the Downton Abbey nostalgia for an aristocratic past, a past which idolises the monarchy, which idolises the aristocracy. So there's a huge nostalgia for that kind of space. And so it was great to see national media take up the story of the historic homes having slave trade links and these hidden stories to come to the fore. This is Harwood House in Yorkshire, in the UK, and I'm using Harwood House here as an example. Harwood House was built very much on money directly from plantations, mainly most of them in Barbados. There are still people in Barbados who carry the name Harwood or Lascelles, are named after the family. I was in consultation with Harwood House because if you go around the exhibition there, you could come away not knowing about the links that the house has with plantation past. So we were looking at ways that we could address this and ways that the public could understand more about the history of the house, and also to use the house and stately homes like it as an educational tool. So instead of shying away from this history or hiding this history from the public, using the house itself as a platform to better educate people about the history of enslavement, the history of colonialism, which is really missing often from the British educational system. So using this as a tool, as an educational platform. And while we're on the subject of Harwood House, I want to share a poem with you quickly. Although I'm not sure you can share a poem quickly, but I shall share a poem with you, which I've written about Harwood House. So I have to take off my academic hat now and put on my poet's hat. So Harwood House is a grand house and estate in Yorkshire, and this poem was inspired by a meeting of Harwood House curators, during which a curator insisted that if any reference to slavery was made in a great house, it mustn't spoil a good day out. As I've said recently, there's been great efforts by the owners to address the historical past and acknowledge the connections between the estate and slavery, and the owners are very much open to that kind of dialogue at the moment. So my poem is called A Good Day Out. Nowadays at Harwood House, you can visit penguins. 2 p.m. is feeding time. You can watch silvery fish disappear down feathered gullets, take a boat on the shimmering lake, munch scones and drink fine tea. It's such a good day out. Below deck, in the cavernous kitchen, a sign celebrates old culinary treasures, sugar, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon once filled these cool, dark larders, spilling their scent in had them at her fingertips. She knew their journey well. Her hands spiced and sweetened cakes and puddings for lords and ladies upstairs reclined. See, here are her dented baking tins and trays. Authentic and robust. This history, take it in. It's such a good day out. But cook knew another story of every Hessian bag of sugar warmed by island heat, each grain distilled from macheted canes, felled by sun-whipped hands. She understands there is no sweetness here, the story of the sugar and the slaves that made her masters rich falls silent on her lips, for it would only spoil a good day out. So that's a poem in response to that idea in Harwood of not wanting to ruin a good day out by confronting people with the reality of the history. You can find out more on BBC website about slavery in Harwood House. And here's some of the headlines talking about how the Harwood House owners acknowledge slave trade history and speak in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to end with talking about statues, memorials, and remembering David Olawale. Now, all of you will be familiar with this iconic image of protesters throwing Edward Colston's statue into the River Avon. Edward Colston was a slave trader, and there's an estimate, he had transported an estimated 84,000 Africans, and of them 19,000 are believed to have died in Middle Passage. He's been standing on his plinth in Bristol for 125 years, and people had had enough. They tried to get him removed, they tried to get the statue replaced, nothing happened. In the end, the protesters threw him into the water, and as you'll see, there's white and black protesters joining together there to do that. And I think this is an image, an iconic image, which really, for the UK, epitomizes the momentum and passion of that summer, of the toppling of the statue, and and there's a kind of poetic justice there with Edward Colston being among the fishes, like the many slaves, many enslaved that died in Middle Passage and were thrown overboard. Finally, I want to end by talking about David Olawale. And I want to do this because as part of the summer of protest that I've taken part in, I was also consulting Leeds City Council about their statues in the city and whether their statues were offensive and whether anything should be done about them. We don't want to sort of another Edward Colston situation in Leeds. So we did a review of all the statues in Leeds. It was open to the public. The public made suggestions, and in the end, none of the statues were decided. It was decided they were not objectionable, but some needed to have better signage, which really reflects and incorporates a history of migration to Leeds, of diverse communities, and also of colonialism. Also, there are projects in Leeds to better celebrate the migrant communities in Leeds, and also to remember some of the devastating racism that happened in the city. So one of these stories is David Olawale. David arrived in Hull to East Yorkshire in 1969. He endured mental ill health, homelessness, racism, and police persecution, which culminated in his drowning in 1969 in the River Aire near Leeds Bridge at the hands of two policemen. And I'm part of the David Olawale Memorial Association, and we believe this is the first case in the UK of policemen causing the death of a black person, the first recorded death. The police officers Elliker and Kitchen were found guilty of actual bodily harm, but acquitted of grievous bodily harm. Elliker spent 3 years in jail, Kitchen 2 years and 3 months. And I've listed there the sorts of horrors that they subjected David to, where they were completely focused on persecuting him over a number of years, because he was a black, vulnerable, homeless man in their city. So some of the things that we do in Leeds to remember these lessons from the past and try and move forward is form the David Olawale Memorial Association, which also uses the arts as a way of remembering these narratives and moving forward. One of the things that we have planned is a big sculpture garden in the city, which is based around remembering Olawale, with a big piece of public art, water features, and a place where people from across the city can join together and diverse communities can come together in an appreciation of the arts. We run all sorts of literary events. We invited Linton Kwesi Johnson to speak at the anniversary, 50th anniversary in the commemoration of Olawale's death in 2019. We've published an anthology of poetry which remembers David Olawale and his story, his hidden, forgotten story. And we've also created a carnival troupe, a Remember Olawale carnival troupe. This is my carnival troupe, Mama Dreads Masqueraders. And this troupe is called We All Migrants, the David Olawale Mass. And you'll see there's a beautiful carnival king figure of David Olawale's face. And we are all hibiscus flowers, because the hibiscus is a flower which symbolizes remembrance. So I just want to end by saying that these are the many ways in which we can facilitate ongoing dialogue to ways to better recognize our history in the UK through the arts and through education and through reframing public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. You were also right on time. We have a very disciplined panel this morning. Thank you so much. So we're going to have about another 20 minutes or so for Q&A and just a general conversation among us about some of the issues that you have raised in your presentations. So I had a question that I thought of even before I even saw the nature of your presentations. And I was going to ask it at the end, but I think I will start with it. For both of you, what do you think at the end of the day will make Black Lives Matter? Simple and complicated all at once. Damion, probably could hear from you first.
Well, that's a very, pointed question. It's simple, but very, very, very loaded and deep. I think, and as I said in my presentation, that for Black lives to matter, there needs to be we need to remove that dehumanized image and perception of Black bodies. And this is steeped in history and continues to replicate and reproduce itself within the contemporary period. So, if we are really going to make Black lives matter in education, right? We're going to make Black lives matter in the way communities are policed, in economic opportunities. You have to begin to see them as human beings first, right? And we have to shatter those pathological images and stigma and stereotypes about Black people. That is what is driving, things like excessive police use of force, inequalities in housing, healthcare, and such the like. So, we can have all sorts of policies, which I talked about, and all sides of legislative changes. Mm. But if that mental, societal, psychological shift does not take place, we're going to be here in another century. Look, this is not new. In the American context, the issue of race has dogged the nation since the very birth of the nation, right? It began with America went to war with itself over this question, right? And centuries later, the same questions are on the table. And my argument is, it is because Black bodies have been dehumanized. They have been stripped of their humanity. And until we turn the wheels the other way and begin to reclothe Black bodies with their humanity, then that process, Black lives will not matter if that process is not done first.
Right. I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, I am in agreement with Damon here, and I think that idea that Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about decolonizing the mind. But when he talks about that, he's focused on decolonizing, for the Gikuyu people to decolonize the mind, for African people to decolonize the mind. But this needs to be done. It needs to be a two-way process. And so for me, I think education is the key. And people need to be having these discussions, these dialogues about race, about perceived differences, about structural inequality, about white privilege. You need to start having these early on. Then it can be introduced in different ways in primary school, in secondary school. Often when my students reach me, I teach post-colonial literature. When they reach me and start doing my courses, they're 18 and they've not studied books by people of color. They've not studied literature which isn't by white American or European authors. So their minds, have been close to this. And I think unless we start to, as Damion says, think about our processes, the ways that people see the Black body and change that perception, nothing is going to change. So I think education is key in that idea of decolonizing the mind. And I think also that a lot of white people are worried about asking certain questions. They're worried about starting the dialogue. They're worried perhaps about voicing some of their biases and their prejudices. There needs to be a space where people can discuss these things openly. So dialogue is key to that decolonization of mind.
Right.
I want to add just before you go, and Emily, rightfully pointed out education, and another another important space where this decolonizing process can take place in tangible ways is through the media. The media has been, I would say, a weaponized space that has bastardized Black and brown bodies. I mean, we can go all the way back to colonial, times, slave societies, and the ways in which, Black bodies have been presented and represented, in news stories, in entertainment, in movies. You see it all everywhere, right? And I think that is another important space within which this process can take place. Thank you.
Right. Yes, Damion. It's so important that you said that. I actually was going to ask a question about the media a little later on. But I just want to stick a pin to just remind our audience on YouTube that we are taking questions from you. We want this to be an interactive conversation. So if you have any questions or comments on our presentations, please feel free to put those there, and I will field those for you. So Damion, since you mentioned the media, just plain devil and or angel's advocate, what role do you think Black and brown entertainers have in perpetuating some of these stereotypes and tropes that you spoke about? I was going to ask a little later on about the fact that you spoke about these tropes and representations of the Black body being violent and hard and tough, both for male and female, but particularly towards an offshoot of hostility and hostile and dangerous kind of masculinities. But I think a lot of Black artists have arguably honed these skills quite well and have represented themselves as these tropes that you are speaking about, and it has done well for them financially. So what type of role do you think Black artists, entertainers, and media personnel have in both perpetuating these tropes and in changing them?
Well, yeah, certainly they do help in perpetuating them, right, in terms of the kinds of roles that they will take in, for example, movie roles. When you look at the sphere of, hip hop music, for example, but we'll put it to you that part of this bastardization and this demonization, predates these eras within which Black bodies, Black entertainers are performing. So there is already this societal view that Black bodies are no good anyways. Right, and so when they are in these performative spaces, it is now being used as, oh yeah, see, we told you that's exactly what they're doing. But I like to point to Chadwick Boseman, for example. Right, Chadwick had several roles offered to him to play, the Black thug, and he turned those posts down. Now, one may argue he was at a particular point in his life, and so he could have, kind of moved away from that. But I think that, Black entertainers and celebrities will have to be deliberate and calculated in the kinds of messages that they are sending. I think also that, in terms of the news media, we need to have more black bodies, literally more Black bodies in the newsroom who are representing and providing stories that are outside the realm of Black pathology. Because oftentimes, what happens is a zooming in and an exaggeration of quote unquote Black crime or Black pathology because of those who are in the newsroom and who is selecting those kinds of stories. So to answer your question squarely, yes, Black people, Black entertainers, those in the industry, they have a role to play, to be deliberate, to be calculated in renouncing and denouncing these kinds of stereotypical perceptions and views. But also, I'd like to turn the arrows, if you will, back on society itself to say, you also have some self-reflection to do, because you have these perceptions, of Black bodies. And I always like to say that my Black pathology, literally my Black pathology, is always a step ahead of me. So when I am in my neighborhood jogging, my body, the ways in which my body has been created by America is that guy is a thug. So even though I may have 3 degrees, even though I work in an academic setting, even though I have a family, and all these nice, wonderful things that we all desire, the perception already is out there that this black body is a pathological body. And that's part of why you have the police stops of black and brown people. They don't see their records. You can't. They see their black skin first.
Right. Emily, anything to add, or would you like?
Well, I just to add that I think the responsibility doesn't or shouldn't perhaps lie with the actors, with the entertainers, but it's the people that create those spaces. It's the people, further up the hierarchy that are creating the roles. It's the directors and the producers and the script writers and the theatres who need to be questioning the type of representations of blackness that they want to put out there. So I think that a lot of entertainers, if they want to be successful, then they end up having to perhaps play roles which don't feel comfortable for them. But it's often a choice between doing things that you feel are ethically grounded or fame, success, the highlights. So I think that's the dilemma that many entertainers face. It was just the discussion reminded me of the work that I've been doing on Brer Rabbit, the trickster figure in America, whereby you have an anarchic African trickster figure, which is Anansi in the Caribbean, much loved Anansi, that gets taken up in America by white folklorists and completely rewritten. So the Brer Rabbit stories were rewritten in the 1800s by Joel Chandler Harris, and he creates a frame narrator who is a slave who's happy with slavery. He's happy with the conditions of slavery, and he's very much a minstrel figure. So this is Uncle Remus. And so black folklore, which is, a cultural form which should channel, a resistance to the status quo, in America becomes a part of the minstrel tradition. And it's just another example of the way that a performance or a narrative will be dominated by white supremacist society.
Right. Very important intervention there. Damion, specifically to you and your work and the space that you now live in, talk to us about defunding the police. I know this is something that has been, you mentioned it in your presentation, and of course the political climate that we're now in has transformed it into this sort of tennis ball, back and forth, with very many complicated implications about this term and concept of defunding the police. So talk to us a little bit about that and what it means in reality. And for you personally, in your area of expertise, what does this mean?
Right. So the calls for defunding the police, as you rightly pointed out, am I on mute? Hold on, let me.
Oh, we're hearing.
Okay. As you rightly pointed out, has become very much partisan and polarized. Mm-hmm. Essentially, the calls for defunding is really saying there should be a redirecting of funds put in police and policing towards more preventative strategies of crime and delinquency. So, there are some police departments whose budgets are in the millions, and the calls are, let us invest some of that money in creating more job opportunities for Black and brown people in their communities. Let us reinvest some of that money in creating better housing conditions for Black and brown people, healthcare, because the data and the research is clear that in environments of socioeconomic lack and in environments of socioeconomic oppression, then delinquency can be one of the outcomes. And so that is where the whole defunding cause has been. And it is controversial. And, I am I am not really torn on it, but I approach it cautiously because there certainly are some tough neighborhoods and spaces to police, right? Let's talk about Chicago, for example. And one of the things that happened, and I think it's quite disingenuous, is that, there are some, political commentators who talk about, oh, what about black on black crime? Black on black crime has absolutely nothing to do with Black Lives Matter. They are two separate things, though there might be some kind of overlap. They're two separate things. The Black Lives Matter movement is saying we need to see a more equitable system generally, but more specifically, a more equitable system of policing in these minority neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Is there black on black crime? Yes, there's white on white crime. I mean, when you talk about crime and crime statistics, it happens within, whites tend to commit more crimes against whites. It happens with blacks. So, defunding the police is a strategy of lifting these spaces out of their conditions of lack and limited access as a way of preventing delinquency and criminal kinds of behavior. But yeah, it has become very politicized and partisan as well.
Yes. Well, even masks have become politicized, so I suspect defunding the police would as well. Emily, I don't know if I had a question specific for you. Do you want to add anything to what Damion has said, or would you like me to ask?
I was just going to add that I think, the question of defunding the police, that money can also be filtered into community organisations which will support youth development, which will support young people and offer them access to education and training.
Yes.
Okay. All right, Emily. So you spoke, one of the things when we think of the United Kingdom in comparison to the United States, which you rightly said, is this sort of subtlety, the British, politeness, that kind of resonates as part of the cultural tapestry of the United Kingdom. So I just wondered, how do you think we can go about further uncovering some of these hidden subtle narratives in a UK city to better acknowledge its connections with enslavement and colonialism, and in order to celebrate diverse cultures?
Okay, so that's a big question, Dahlia. Now, I think that some of the work that's been happening, and I've been involved with as an example over the summer, is starting up these conversations. So a review, of the way the city celebrates itself. What do we see around the city? When we walk around Leeds, we see a celebration of great white men, of the aristocracy, of Christianity, and of colonial conquest. That's what we see in the city. So how can we change that narrative? And the fact that councillors are now thinking about ways that they can celebrate a more diverse city, and we're opening up those dialogues. There's public consultation is a really positive step forward, as is the dialogue that's happening with stately homes in the UK. And there's a wonderful project called Colonial Countryside, which is run by Corinne Fowler, an academic in Leicester, which is inviting young people into stately homes and telling them about the hidden narratives of the homes. So the black servants that might have worked there, the connections with colonialism and so on, and the young people then write their own stories about those people. So those kind of dialogues are taking place. However, as soon as we start those kind of dialogues, there's a backlash. And so for the statues review, for example, a lot of the comments are racist comments in response to the public review. A lot of the comments when we talk about stately homes, and especially online, will be all about, get over it, stop dredging up the past, haven't you people stop moaning, and this sort of thing. And people feel emboldened when they're on social media to put those forms of opinion across. In the UK, often if you confront somebody face to face, they don't dare to actually stand by the opinions that they might share in other settings. As I said, I do think one of the things that would try and sort of counteract this old English diplomacy, as Sam Selvin writes in Lonely Londoners, is to allow people the space to express themselves, and to feel that they can examine their bias and examine their privileges in a safe space. That's what I try and set up in the classroom. We've got quite a diverse set of students. Most of them the majority are white, but a safe space where they can talk about how they feel and what sort of prejudices they bring to the table. I don't think British people with our sort of stiff upper lip mentality are very good at self-analysis, and not very good sometimes at expressing their emotions, their gut reactions to things. So if we could try and find ways to facilitate that dialogue, then we're moving forward.
Okay. I had so many questions, but we will have to wrap up soon because we have jobs and we have a time difference with Emily. We're so appreciative of you both joining, and families and everything. So I really just wanted the last question to be a little personal. So we are in an academic space and we are speaking to a mixed audience, but as persons, as people, Damion, I thought it was so important and interesting that you mentioned your own positionality, your own situatedness within this narrative. You are a Black, Caribbean, Jamaican who is in a foreign space where race is looked at in a little different way. You have a family, you have a child. Emily, I know you have children as well, and you often include them in your activism, which I think is such a wonderful thing that you do as a parent and as an educator. So as people, not as academics, as people, are you concerned for your children, for your families? And how are you assisting your families, your children in negotiating these types of things that we're speaking about? Damion, you could go first.
Yes, I'm very concerned. Yeah, and you rightly say, I have these intersections, right? So I'm a Jamaican, I'm a Caribbean man, I'm an immigrant. In a southern state, North Carolina. I teach at a predominantly white institution, and I will answer a question by talking about, the other day we have two boys, we're raising two boys, and my 2-year-old, I saw him with an American flag, and he likes to run around with the American flag and he's waving it. And when I saw him do that, I was sad. I was gripped with sadness because I'm like, this young Black boy is so enamored, is so in love with playing with this, American flag. And I asked the question, will America love him back? And that's the question that, Black and brown people have been asking this country since the very birth of the nation. We have served in your military. We have served in healthcare. We have served in education. We have worked in your coal mines. We have worked on your railways. We have served in your hospitals in the midst of a pandemic. We have delivered your pizzas. We have been in your universities. We are doctors. We are scientists. We are engineers. We have given our sweat, our blood, our time for this country. Why will America not love back its Black and brown people, particularly its Black people? And I'm confounded by that question. Of course, when I came to America, and I say this story in my presentations, there's a September morning, I remember it distinctly. In 2008, I was on campus at Virginia Tech again, at the top of the South, but still the South. And, I was walking towards campus and I saw a young lady walking. I didn't know where the library was. So I approached her and say, hey, can you tell me where the library is? And immediately she clutched onto her bag and started rushing in the opposite direction. Instinctively, I don't know where that came from. I went into my pocket, took out my student ID, and I'm like, no, I'm a Virginia Tech student. I just need to know where the library is. And she, I could see her fear de-escalate, and she was like, oh, it's that way. Of course, I didn't go to the library that way. I went back to my apartment, and I thought about, and I asked myself, what does this black skin mean? Because coming from the Jamaican context, it didn't have that kind of meaning at all. Okay. And since 2008, that fall of 2008, I continue to ask that question. what does my black skin mean? I've gotten the answers, and it's a question that I ask of for my children, particularly because I have black boys, and they will confront, unfortunately, systemic racism. Because not until this rehumanizing of black bodies take place, then it is something that all black and brown families and people are asking that question: why will America not love us back?
Right. Emily?
So my position is obviously slightly different to Damien's, because I'm lighter skinned, and so people recognize me sometimes as, most people recognize me as mixed. Some white people even recognize me as white. My mother was dark skinned, and my father was a white Englishman. And in our family, it seems in a lot of interracial marriages, we've had one child is very light skinned and one child is quite dark skinned. So my brother is quite dark skinned. And so when I was born, my Martinican grandmother said, "Oh, elle a peau sauvée," which is saved skin. And so that for her, it was, I had kind of access to a better life through having lighter skin. For me, I think that it gives me even more of a sort of impetus to keep my Caribbean ancestry alive, and that narrative alive for my children. My son said once to my mother, he said, "Why can't I change to have dark skin like you and be more like you?" So there's a complexity around being mixed race that I think isn't really examined in great detail. There is a sense that you perhaps are neither here nor there, but at the same time, by being light-skinned and mixed, you then also are somebody who shatters any kind of monolithic ideas around race. Mm-hmm. I find that when I'm in the UK, people think that it's exotic to have hair like this. And if I go out, it's always, can I touch my hair? Some drunk person will always try and put their fingers in my hair and just think that it's okay. And I even thought of reversing that and maybe going up to a woman with long blonde hair and asking her if I could touch her hair, just to see the reaction. Because, but so I have a certain level of privilege that I must enjoy, and I scrutinize constantly from being lighter skinned. But then I also am very committed to making sure that my children are clear about their African ancestry, their Caribbean heritage, and bringing them into all the work that I do around that.
Wonderful. Well, we will have to wrap up here, but I really want to thank you both so much for taking the time to be part of this series. It's been a riveting, thought-provoking conversation. Some of the comments from our chat are speaking to that. People are really hanging on to every word and having their own conversation, saying it's a great discussion. So really want to thank you. You've been a wonderful set of panelists. And I would also like to thank the Faculty of Humanities and Education, particularly Dr. Nicole Plummer, my very close friend and sister, who is Associate Dean, Marketing and Outreach, for this wonderful series. And I invite persons to not only watch this one, but to watch the others in the series on the UE Mona media page on YouTube. Really want to thank our MITS, Mona Information Technological Services team, who has done such a wonderful job this morning. And of course, I have to thank our audience on YouTube. So thanks again, Dr. Blake. Thanks, Dr. Marshall. Please have a wonderful day. Please be safe. We know we're also dealing with the pandemic. Please be safe. And we'd like to thank your families. I know you both have young children and you're hoping that you'll be able to get through this. This is the era we're now in. Children are, yes, we made it. So thank you so much to your families for basically giving you the space and time to do the presentation. And I invite our audience and all those listening to do what you can to make Black Lives Matter today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bean and Dr. Marshall. Take care.